Are we ready? Perfect. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today in person at ODI Global headquarters in London and of course online. We are really delighted to be given this opportunity to welcome a very distinguished panel of speakers in the occasion of the launch of a book which has just been published by Philip Krauss and Richard Allen. And that gives us a really great opportunity to take stock, sit down, take stock of what has happened in the last 15 years or so in the field of public finance management, which is a field that is riveting, in particular for those involved in PFM, but actually really, really fundamentally important. And I was just commenting before how the news these days in the UK, the political news, are focusing very much around the difficult decisions entailed by PFM. So we'll have this discussion around the book, but of course taking this opportunity to reflect more broadly what's going on in the world and where we may be going. We have, as I said, very pleased to have the two authors, Philip Krauss and Richard Allen. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Philip and Richard, although I am sure they need no introduction. But nevertheless, let me go through my notes. So Philip Krauss is research fellow at the University of Potsdam. And Philip is an international expert in public finance and public administration. Until 2022, he led the technical team at CABRI, the African Network of Ministries of Finance, based in Pretoria. And previously, he served as the Gates Foundation Deputy Director for Country Finance. Between 2012 and 2016, I'm very pleased to say that he's actually led and built the public finance team at ODI Global in London. So I'm extremely grateful for all the foundational work you've done, setting up a stellar team, which I'm benefiting on now. I realize I haven't introduced myself. I'll say that in a second. But he also, Philip also had various appointments with the World Bank, GIZ, the government of Mexico. So a very long career in PFM. Now moving to Richard Allen, who is actually online. Hello, Richard. Thank you so much for having you. Richard Allen is a senior consultant at Global Advisor and Global Advisor on Public Finance. Richard is actually a former staff member and deputy division chief of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF, which is obviously absolutely key in this field. He was also a senior research associate with ODI Global, and before joining the IMF, Richard was a senior official at the UK Treasury, the OECD, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank, and a board member at the European Investment Bank. So really incredibly illustrious. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining. We also have a very impressive, all the more impressive panelists. And let me introduce first to Andy King. Andy is a specialist partner at Flint Global, where he leads, Flint's economic modeling and analysis. And before joining Flint, Andy spent 10 years at the UK Budget Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, most notably as a member of the OBR Executive Budget Responsibility Committee for 5 years, a very important role indeed. He also chaired the Climate Working Group at the OECD Network of Independent Fiscal Institutions, and prior to that, Andy held various senior roles in macroeconomics and fiscal policy at the Treasury. He also advised at the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department and advised Ministry of Finance in Africa and Asia. And he's also a visiting senior fellow at the LSE Grantham Research Institute, where he focused on the fiscal implication on climate change and net zero. And finally, last but not least, of course, we are delighted to welcome Chigomedzo Medga-Gelders, who is head of Public Financial Management and Microeconomics at the FCDO. Chigo, as I think you are mostly known, previously served as the head of strategic capability and head of profession for governance at FCDO, and the former, of course, DFID. Her experience includes leadership roles and senior governance advisor in Sierra Leone and South Sudan. Chigo brings deep expertise in delivering governance and economic reform in fragile and conflict-affecting settings and shaping UK government approaches to governance, public finance, and macroeconomic policy. Thank you so much, Chigo, for joining us. A very warm welcome to everybody in London. So I am Frédéric Dahan. I'm the Director of Public Finance and Development Finance here at ODI Global. And it's really my privilege to be moderating this panel and presentation today. So we will first hear from the author, presenting the book, the content, and explaining perhaps the genesis, but also what this book is intended to shape the future. And then we will have a reaction from our panels to what has been discussed and reflection, digging, of course, into their deep expertise. And then we'll open the floor in the room, but also online. We are monitoring the Q&A, so don't hesitate if you are online to share your comments and questions. But without further ado, Philippe, the floor is yours.
And I'm just going to pass it right back to Richard, because I think Richard is going to kick us off.
Okay, thank you, Philip, and thank you, Frédéric, for your introduction, and welcome and good afternoon to everyone. I apologize that I'm not present today in physical terms, but I am very happy to be a member of the group, and very happy to join the meeting. I just want to make a few points, and Philip will then continue. In the last 15 years, several shocks have impacted on the world economy. These include financial shocks, particularly the global financial crisis, the energy crisis and global warming, COVID-19, and a series of wars and international political crises. As a result of these shocks, the world has experienced a huge rise of borrowing and debt burdens. In some countries, over 100% is a debt burden. These shocks have impacted especially on finance ministries, including in developing countries. And as a result of this, public financial management has taken the center of the stage. It was long thought of as a backroom topic. Since the global financial crisis, no longer is that the case. It has also become more academic, with a huge growth in literature, as the volume demonstrates. The volume is actually a little bit ambiguous about the academic role of PFM. Probably because it's a mixture of economics, accountancy, public management, and other disciplines. But I think there is no doubt that the subject has become more academic as a result of the developments over the last 15 years. Ministries of Finance have been overwhelmed with new responsibilities, in addition to their classic roles for fiscal policy, budgeting, cash and debt management, and so on. These responsibilities are discussed in the book. They include green PFM, gender-related budgeting, fiscal risk analysis, fiscal transparency, fiscal sustainability, emergency financing, and of course, the digitalization of public finance, the introduction of AI, AI trends. There's also been a trend which has its pluses and minuses towards greater public participation in budgeting and fiscal policy issues. And these matters are discussed in the volume. Ministries of Finance have partly responded to these challenges by offloading some functions to independent or quasi-independent agencies, such as revenue authorities, debt management officers, procurement officers, fiscal councils, and so on. And line ministers have also taken greater responsibility for budget execution, infrastructure investment, cash management, and other functions, other central finance functions. Ministers of Finance have also responded by becoming more policy-oriented, less transaction-focused. This trend is a good development, which is generally to be encouraged, and I think you can find it most apparently in advanced and some emerging markets. It remains a challenge in many developing countries, which are still focused on a transactions approach to public management. As a result of these developments, many ministers of finance remain in a state of flux. You see around the world, new public finance laws, new roles and responsibilities, new organizational structures. Today is a period of transition. Philip and I put together this book as a way of highlighting some of these important issues and trends since 15 years ago. And we've also looked at the way forward. It's my privilege to be here this afternoon, and I will now hand over to Philip for his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much.
Frederic, thank you. Thank you, Richard. I should, of course, start out with a small disclaimer, which is that Richard and I are two authors of this edited volume. There are several other authors in the room, and I think a few more might be with us online today for this discussion. We approached the process of editing this book from a perspective of let a thousand flowers bloom, essentially. So there was no attempt really to try and come up with the canonic statement that everybody had to sign up to, which in conversely then also means that what I'm saying right now, that somebody else reading the book might come up with very different conclusions. So I've tried to break this up basically into three larger points. One about the developments of PFM as far as I can make sense of them over the period that we were looking at, roughly the last 15-ish years. If we can go to the next slide, please.
You have a...
Oh, I have it.
Yep.
I have a clicker.
Sorry.
I don't even have to ask someone.
That's it.
Awesome. Okay, that is great. So the big summary that we put into the introduction was the foundations of good PFM have evolved but not fundamentally changed. If you look at the developments in the different chapters, that is essentially the finding that, to the extent that you can come up with any summary, then this would be it. And I'd be very happy to discuss that further during the discussion. The next point is adaptation under stress. There's, of course, a presumption that we are talking here about a succession of major crises that then are supposed to have led, or that were major enough that it makes sense for us to start and go looking for, okay, so what are the lessons that we have learned from the great financial crisis? What are the lessons that we have learned from COVID and so on? And there's a set of policy lessons that you can think about, and that is certainly something that has made it into the newspapers much more. This whole discussion during the 2010s about the sort of overeager return to austerity, that there wasn't enough spending at a time when spending was still necessary, all lessons that were then applied with varying degrees of enthusiasm by the time that the COVID crisis came along, and those are sort of the two bookends to our period of most acute interest here. About the institutional lessons, it's a little bit more complicated. And there are certainly institutional lessons that have been learned, but maybe the most important one really is that there's now a lot more information and a lot more understanding, very nuanced at the country level, about what happens if we do this in this context. What happens if we introduce this particular reform? If anybody today is interested in having a conversation with fiscal rules, different kinds of fiscal rules in different places, then, you know, there are lots of places where you can go. And even though you could have done the same thing in 2008, realistically, in a lot of regions in the world, we were basically looking at a handful of years, maybe a decade of sort of well-documented experience then, and a lot more breadth and depth available now. On a slightly more negative note, as far as we can make out, there's no across-the-board improvement in either fiscal performance. I mean, that point is fairly obvious, but also not in the quality of PFM systems. Which is not to say that there haven't been sometimes stunning success stories within that big and complicated house that is the PFM system, but it would be very, very difficult to make the argument. And of course, I know that some have tried that this has sort of been the steady improvement across the board in most countries most of the time. Of course, partly this is a difficult argument to make because we wouldn't quite know how to measure these things properly, and so the lack of good data is part of the concern there. However, something that we're definitely seeing now that was much less the case 15, 20 years ago is that there is now much more a global conversation about public finance systems, public finance management. There's much less of this notion that there may be 5 countries in the world that are worth emulating, and everybody else is sort of at various stages of distance from those 5 country models. And if you look at different areas of public finance, then, you know, I would probably think that half of Europe would probably benefit from some technical assistance from India, for instance, about certain aspects of public financial management, and you wouldn't have been able to make that point 15 years ago. Now, the next one is about PFM as a field or as a discipline. Oops. Oh, sorry. And you're going to see, as I'm talking about this, that I'm still struggling with the terminology here, which means that even after having worked, you know, for a good number of years on PFM, I'm not entirely sure I really know what PFM actually is. So it is a multidisciplinary field that brings with it strengths and weaknesses. The ability to draw on insights from different academic disciplines, the absence of a very easy sort of groupthink default set of things that everybody would draw to without having any further discussions about what is it that the ideal set of answers would be that we are looking at with a particular question. Those are all sources of strength. On the other side, there is a lack of a clear academic home, and you can talk about this under different headings, but one thing that we were talking a lot when we were discussing different chapters of the book and we were trying to sum up the book is this issue that there is, if you look around into different disciplines, then there's a lot of really cool and really interesting academic work that is being done that we would read as PFM work, that isn't that doesn't self-identify as PFM, essentially. And that sometimes shows up as just political science. It shows up as work on fiscal institutions. It's the sort of the law of budgeting and so on and so forth. And that is sort of, it almost follows automatically from living in very different academic homes, but it raises the question of how do you connect these areas up in a way that makes it really possible for people who are working on this in the field to utilize all the information, all the lessons learned, and all the evidence that is sort of out there without basically having your own sort of preconceived lenses of when I think of PFM, then this is, you know, it's that narrow slice and nothing else is worth looking at. And then you're obviously missing out a lot. I'm also wondering, and I think this is something that Richard has also touched upon in his remarks, is this question of, are we beginning to lose track a little bit of the bread and butter work of what PFM is all about, with a lot of attention obviously being paid. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time working on the edges of PFM, that is PFM in health, PFM in other sectors, this lens on PFM, the nexus between PFM and climate change and so on, where of course there's a perception that these are areas where we don't quite know, and therefore we need to invest more in just setting out our stores, defining what the field is really all about, what the tools are, et cetera, et cetera. But it also means that at the core issues and concerns, budgeting, macro fiscal management, and so on and so forth, I think at the global level hasn't quite received the same care and attention that these marginal topics, without using that term in any pejorative sense of the word, have received. Okay, so final set of things on the outlook, where to from here. So I'm posing this as a set of questions, and hopefully this is not something that you would allow me to get away with without further discussion. So the first point, PFM during polycrisis, is the bag of tools ready for the next challenge? I think that is probably the case. I personally don't think that if you look at an area like climate change and the fiscal and public finance management response to climate change, that would necessitate something that is completely outside of the universe of sort of PFM tools and instruments that we already have. So the workshop is basically there. It's much more a question of which are the tools that you're taking out of the workshop. The second one is, are finance ministries ready to keep the balance between their core functions and an expectation to lead on new issues? And there I'm cautiously pessimistic. I think it's sort of in the nature of the setup of a Ministry of Finance that the more successful you are at the core function of maintaining fiscal discipline and keeping a lid on spending control, the more you're going to feel tempted to say yes to things which in your heart of hearts you should actually know that should be in the bailiwick of somebody else, some other part of government, which then inevitably causes a political backlash after a certain number of years. And that sort of back and toing and froing is just built into the role and is built into the architecture of how we work in modern central governments today, and that's not going to go away. Does the PFM discipline know how to integrate digital innovation into each of its subfields? No, I think that is, we have a lot of work to do in that area. We, I think, concluded the introduction of the book on a question of, can we really get away with having a separate digitization chapter in a survey volume like this, when this comes around for the next edition in 2030 or 2032. And there's this a classic problem, I suppose, of how do you keep these things connected when you want to have innovation and you want to have people who are thinking about digital PFM and nothing else pretty much, so that they can focus about what is new and what is innovative, but it just creates then a little bit of tension between those ideas and those discussions and the other subset of things where we're still having a separate conversation about the payment systems and downstream PFM without digital, which sort of makes you wonder what is that then, and what is it supposed to be in a couple of years' time? What is there? What is left if it doesn't start and finish with a deep appreciation of what this means in a digital world? And then the final question is, does PFM as a multidisciplinary, it's definitely not a multidisciplinary discipline, multidisciplinary field, whatever, multidisciplinary craft, does it need more attention, networking, knowledge sharing, and so on, especially from its most powerful stakeholders and beneficiaries? And I think I would say yes, that is an area that is being neglected. That is being neglected a little bit and is coming up, especially in 2025, as a growing concern on my mind. I think if you imagine the last 15 years as a world without the big expansion of aid on a global scale and the big increase in the interest of maybe primarily through a fiduciary lens, but ultimately through a whole lot of other perspectives also, the international interest in what is it that a PFM system does as a vehicle for funding from different sources to be administered and so on. If the next 15 years are now going to be very different from the last 15 years as far as that is concerned, and if there's also then a little bit more fatigue amongst the big funders at a global level, then I worry a little bit that over time, then there's going to be, a fiscal policy take on PFM. There's going to be an accounting take on PFM, a law take on PFM, but nobody, and all the connecting elements, they're all still going to be there. But I wonder, what is the institution going to be that then says we consider ourselves to be a little bit of the custodians who are holding this together, who would then invest things like journals, publications, conferences, events, and so on. And as much as I would enjoy the idea, I think that is a heavy burden to put on the shoulders of an organization like ODI, which I'm sure would relish that responsibility, but wouldn't quite have the muscle, to be able to pull it off. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Philip, and thank you very much, Richard, for this introduction. We are going to move to our panel who will react. But if you can take advantage of my position, I was listening to you with great interest, and I can see how, no doubt, we will have a very robust discussion. But something really struck me in what you said. I heard that although a lot of lessons have been learned on PFM, your view is at the global level, there have been no significant improvement. But at the same time, when the question is faced with this increasing wave of crisis, is the toolbox complete and ready? Your answer is yes. So to me, that strikes as a little of a paradox. Can you explain a little bit whether the paradox is intended or not?
Sure, and we should come back to that in the discussion as well. But my sense is that if you look at areas where we have seen a lot of innovative work taking place in the last 10 to 15 years, that they haven't fundamentally reinvented the way that PFM is working. There's evolution, not revolution. We in this book didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the whole issue of institutional reform, PFM reform, and so on. This is much more a survey of where do we stand in these different subfields and subsectors of the discipline. But my sense is that this is much more a question of, do you have the political ability, the administrative chops, the institutional wherewithal to make use of the tools that are there and combine and recombine them in a new and different way, rather than looking at a challenge, for instance, like climate change, which we've been talking and thinking about a lot in the last 5 years in particular, with sort of a sense of just awe and wonder. What is it that we're going to be able to do? As a policy challenge, I agree. I look at that also with a sense of awe and wonder, and I'm not quite sure. But if you were to look into the PFM toolbox, I think the instruments are there.
Great. Thank you very much, Philip. Turning to Andy, please feel free to react to what Philip and Richard have presented, sharing your experience. And one of the area where perhaps you could also share your own reflection is indeed on the question of climate change and how PFM particular has embraced how to address this climate risk. What's your take on the progress that has been made or not?
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think I'll say a little bit about the general and then the climate, because flicking through some of the book, as I've been able to so far, it did force me, I think, into the same moment Philip had of like, this has been my life, and yet I'm not sure I know how to define it. And so stepping back a bit, I thought, for me, PFM is the systems and the processes. So PFM is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to governing well. And, trite comment, to govern is to choose, and good choices require good information. And that's what the PFM system should deliver. So PFM done well provides a foundation of good information to make good policy choices. Obviously, the context matters. And as Richard set out, the fiscal context today is just horrible in so many countries because of a series of shocks that have been large and ongoing challenges, whether they're pressures or new shocks, so more conflict and the climate and aging, all putting pressures on. And to be honest, I think worst of all is that growth has slowed so much. And growth slowing turns those choices from allocating the proceeds of growth to you have to take from someone if you want to give more to someone else. Now, in a PFM world, that's a very clear distinction. That's the difference between incremental budgeting and zero-based budgeting. And the second one is just, it's a lot harder for the technocrats and the decisions are much tougher for the politicians. So this obviously is where PFM should come to the fore. And it's also where PFM is going to be more resource intensive. And so you can immediately see the challenges, and maybe that's where some of the contradiction between have things improved, are we ready, might come from. So how far can better PFM help us today? Frankly, I find myself find it quite hard to be optimistic about that. Not because the systems are not there. I mean, I was on the inside when the UK developed the furlough scheme in the space of a few weeks because the digital system was available and it could be turned around to use it for a different means. So that kind of innovation is there. But the whole shift that, I felt on the inside and I watch from the outside of, technocratic answers are not as popular as populist answers these days. And PFM is a technocratic discipline, it leaves you a little bit worried that just being able to provide better information through a better PFM system will change anything. People, well, taking the UK context, people will still say that they want better public services and someone else to pay for them, which is what all the polls and the focus groups lead people to. So one message I actually thought I was quite pleased to see throughout the bits of the book that I have read is it's kind of an honest take on what's happened. It's not a proselytizing volume. It's quite honest about where PFM reform has, helped and helped less. I know, like, my career has been in the UK, but I have dabbled in the kind of technical assistance that you will all be much more familiar with. And arriving in a country to do a 2-week technical assistance mission where hundreds of pages of PFM legislation have been brought in from another country to be adapted is, it's just not, it doesn't feel right. And I think the book kind of comes across as it isn't right. I've always thought of, the job of government economist, government analyst, PFM provider is sort of engineer-like. You deal with the next problem, and then you've got a better system, and something else will be the next problem. So I think I'm a firm believer in evolution, not revolution, is the right answer. But turning to the climate side, so I thought the green PFM chapter and also the fiscal risks of climate section were fascinating. I think the book rightly draws out that it's a new field that could be very valuable if it is integrated into the system or mainstreamed, as the jargon seems to have been chosen. But it can be quite a costly distraction if you just do it to tick the box that you've done something green. So in the circles I move in, I hear of quite a few finance ministries with a bit of buyer's remorse about green tagging. Mm-hmm. They invest a lot of effort in tagging their entire expenditure system. And then someone says, well, and what's the impact on emissions? I don't know. We've got a yes-no system, and yes-no doesn't tell you. But actually, okay, it does give you the information set to start answering that question. And for me, that's where PFM and climate has to go next. Is what you want to do is integrate something that says that we already do. How does the economy affect the public finances? How do the public finances affect the economy? That's standard MTFF in PFM language. We should be able to do the same with emissions. That should be 3 things that are integrated into one. And so that's the thing that I find exciting for the next steps on PFM and green, things that I've been working on with the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, that I was able to do at the OBR in the UK, where we did some interesting and I think quite useful fiscal scenarios of different climate change futures and different climate mitigation futures. What I didn't realize when we were doing it in the UK was that we were almost uniquely well placed to do so, because the Climate Change Committee in the UK publishes incredibly detailed estimates of how much investment is required economy-wide to achieve net zero. I have done this in other countries since and find myself doing a lot of gap filling that's not PFM work. It's actually that kind of Climate Change Committee work of what is the abatement cost of getting this sector to this emissions target. Now, obviously, the World Bank are doing that in great detail through their climate change and development reports, which are incredible, but are also a little bit beyond, I think, the capability of the finance ministries that then receive the report. Hard to replicate, hard to use. So my personal view, plug for the work I'm doing, is finance ministry needs something simpler that can be integrated into the way they do their work, which still involves a lot of spreadsheets. And you do need clever models, but you need to be able to take the insights from them and put them in your MTFF spreadsheet. I thought the book made one really good point about climate change and PFM, which is that this is basically analyzed as a risk now, but it's not a risk. It's the core of what's going on for finance ministries. They're having to deal with the costs of climate change. They're having to deal with the costs of events. They're having to finance the policies. So really, this is core PFM. And whether people are actively mainstreaming it or just letting the world force it into the system, it's going to be part of the core. If I've got 1 minute, the final thing I wanted to say was that it was just really lovely through the book to see Christopher Hood mentioned so many times. I was lucky enough to act as his sounding board on the book he wrote on the Treasury's public spending system. Such a brilliant man who wore it very lightly, and so very well, very sorely missed.
Thank you so much, Andy. Great. I'm sure Philip and Richard, you'll have a lot to respond. But if I may, let us first hear from Chigo. So Chigo, again, very happy for you to respond to the book. But where I would love to hear a little bit your response is on Philip mentioned in his introduction how from the global financial crisis to now, we have now a global conversation, and the idea that advanced economies have got all sorted out on PFM and emerging market and developing countries and just have to follow suit has been smashed. But you work at the FCDO and you've been really core, and you still are, of course, around the support that FCDO has been giving to supporting the reform of PFM. What are your take based on that experience and what you read of the take that Philip and Richard and of course other author about where we stand today?
Super. Thank you. Right. So that actually fits with the exam questions that you'd sent me. And I thought what I would do is maybe just sort of set out a little bit why this conversation is timely and really tagging on to some of what Andy also covered about the things he enjoyed about the book. Then a couple of responses to some of the key threads, which I'm hoping also touch to some of what you've just intimated here, Frederica. And then I did want to close off with a couple of final reflections, which hopefully bring it back to what does that mean for us in FCDO and I as sort of leading our PFM portfolio in the sorts of things we're thinking about or we want to do and think about a little bit more. So in terms of why I think this book struck with me, why the conversation is timely, I picked 3 things, but in no way to the authors are they just 3 things. It's amongst the many. So I think the first thing for me was just how refreshing it was to see that we were formally shifting the gears around talking about PFM as being about power and how power is distributed and how it is manifested. So who gets what, where, and when in terms of the public purse is all about manifestation of power. It is not a technocratic issue or matter. Yes, some of what you need to do around how you organize the system to do so does touch on some of those technical elements. But at the heart of this, it's about the nature and distribution of power. And we're putting that front and center in the book. Well, at least that's how I read it. So I thought that was really good. Then the second, it really does touch in very neatly with some of the conversations I know as the international development community we're having around what an enduring set of development partnerships begins to look like in a world where, you know, as speakers earlier to me have talked about, you know, a declining pot of other resources, sort of a way in which we need to think harder and smarter around the use of different levers in how we do and drive development. But I think at the heart of that is using this shift and evolution to take a very hard look around how we engage with our partner countries. So i.e. they are leading the reforms that we are saying we are trying to do, including in areas of PFM. And it means thinking about how we are genuinely investing in understanding people, politics, and purpose. But it really just brings out this whole importance about how we do and think about development differently, which matches with some of what we're thinking about. And then thirdly, it was this piece around PFM as a multidisciplinary arena. It is an area I think very passionately about, not least because in my PFM team, I've got a whole mix of excellent disciplines that come together and fuse together. So I am certainly wanting to be part of that conversation, Philip, that talks about, so how do we codify this in a way that recognizes that that's a community of practice that thrives on the diversity and the inclusion of what those different perspectives bring. And the nature of the challenges, what you call the polycrisis, suggests to me that you've got to think about it through that lens if you're going to arrive at the solution. And I would argue our PFM work is the junction box or whatever that is that powers the system. So really refreshing to see that recognition and giving us the impetus, I think, to think about all of this together. So then I think what I wanted to also then touch on a little bit about here is, so I think we had a set of threads around this piece on whether we are acknowledging that countries have some of the basics of PFM, and for partners like ourselves, what does this mean in terms of what could be done? So I wanted to just touch on that a little bit. I really like and accept that point the book makes about what the definition of basic might be, and that it is elusive. But I did want, and I know this is not what the authors are trying to do, to suggest that when you are investing in form, i.e. laws, fiscal calendars, and treasury systems, that in itself isn't important. But I think I wanted to just highlight that some of that, i.e. the institution of form, is political as a process in itself. And we know that there are instances where formal rules do codify who's responsible for what. In a lot of these countries we work in, including the South Sudans, they do help cushion rent-seeking behavior, even if it's quite small and incremental. And function can't really happen without form. So rules do matter and they are important. I know this is not what the authors are suggesting, but I did want to just underscore that. But I think for us as development partners, that piece for me is flagging this sort of follow-up set of PFM reforms that we need to think about, that are more about recognizing that it is a political process. It is thinking about how you bring more functionality to the system rather than form. So that is extremely important. And what that actually means, if you're saying those are the things that you want to do with government, so working less with reforms, but rather with reformers, and how you identify what those entry points look like. Now, do PFM reforms continue to be the focus for bilaterals like FCDO going forward? Absolutely. I would argue that now more than ever, but I think this book is telling us to think about it and do it differently. I think the three threads that I wanted to flag are sort of evolutions that are telling us that we need to do this differently and in a way that is perhaps out of the box, that confirms with what the book is saying. I think the first is this piece around the frequency of crisis, so the polycrisis piece, and how we need to think about PFM reforms that are about how we help governments to be more flexible and adaptive and context aware of the sorts of things they need to do, but being at the center of the things that they do in terms of driving those reforms. So there's that piece about flexible and adaptive PFM reforms that respond to how the governments themselves are equipped to do what they need to do and to deploy this rich set of tools that we've built in terms of the toolkits. The second is this piece around the evolving social contracts and state-citizen relationships. And you touched on that as well when you were talking about the UK piece and sort of an evolving state dynamic and so on. And for me, I think it's about the first piece of how we work with partner governments who are increasingly having to navigate an evolving and complex nature of state-society relationships. but also on the UK side, how we increasingly have to demonstrate the value for money and the bang for the buck for the order resource envelope that we have to a UK taxpayer who is increasingly complex in the way that they interact with us and how politicians respond accordingly. I think the two things I also wanted to flag there, which were more pieces of work we've been talking about and thinking about and are doing, is the work that Paolo and Warren and team are doing around coalitions and how you think about how you build coalitions around fiscal accountability systems. So you're bringing as many stakeholders under that tent to work with and interact with them, but also the reimagining public finance agenda that we're partnering with the bank and the ODI team on. Then I think at the heart of that for me is the role of ministries of finance, which was touched on by Philippe and is quite interesting. In my view, it's about repositioning their role as coordinators of ecosystems too, because they have to be at the heart of some of what is seemingly a very interlinked way of how we drive reform and think about reform. The third piece for me was the digital disruption and the integration of AI, data, and so on. The book is very clear about the need to be cautious about how we adopt digital solutions. They are not an end in themselves. So it's about thinking about how we use and leapfrog that for reform. So the work we're thinking about with you and Cajal, Federica, about how we work with your agenda on really thinking about public finance in a digital era and how we leapfrog that and draw on that is excellent. And for me, it's a real interesting way of illustrating the sorts of partnerships we in FCDO continue to want to nurture and continue to grow as part of pushing the boundaries, to answer your question on how we think about doing PFM reforms differently, more and better. Then 3 closing remarks, which hopefully sort of also land what you had in mind in that follow-up question you had for me. I think the first for us in FCDO, in terms of the thinking I am trying to do with my team on this agenda, is this piece that the book also intimates about some of the progress we've made about understanding the politics and the political economy of reform. And you can argue that as donors, we are getting better around conducting political economy analysis and being quite explicit about what the findings are telling us about the entry points for reform. But I think this is now about moving it the next step to how you hardwire the outcomes of those analyses, and they become part of the routine decisions we take to understand how we drive and deliver reform. So politically grounded reforms becoming the norm rather than the exception, which you can argue is what we've been doing a bit, but we need to do more and better. Some of the research that we've been doing, including with Joachim, and I know there'll be a few others on the line who are part of helping us to do a bit of sort of thinking hard about how we can be robust about, is understanding what the evidence is telling us, where this has been an exception, where we've invested in doing some of that, what it looks like, and how we can learn from that. The second piece is this capabilities piece. So I think this book is telling us what I think we are thinking about also around how we build capabilities better, very different from capacity, which is where you're really trying to think about systems, you're thinking about behaviors, and you're thinking about norms. And arguably some of our peer-to-peer work, which is long-term, embedded, and works to building partnerships and relationships, is part of that. So some of the work we've been doing through HMRC on tax, we've just stood up a PFM and fiscal policy peer-to-peer with HMT, and we've got a long-standing NAO peer-to-peer on audit. But I look at those as ways in which we can do more and better on capacity building, but tagging on and partnering more and better with multilaterals and other partners who, as you know, are first movers on a lot of things. But this piece about capacity building models and how we do capacity building on PFM, which is more about, of course, sort of enabling some of the form and the functionality, but helping PFM officials also understand how you analyze, navigate power relationships, broker relationships, coalitions, and so on. What we usually call the softer stuff, but it's actually not the soft stuff. It's the hard stuff, because that's the stuff that makes it all stick. And then the last piece, I promise I'll shut up in a second, I'm over my 10 minutes. It's something around thinking really hard on how we tell the story on results and the metrics we use to tell that narrative. If it's about the sorts of reforms we've just talked to that the book is capturing and what we've just set out here. It means it's, yes, a bit more of the numerics, but it's also about the narrative. And how do we push boundaries on that? We're absolutely in for partnering and working with others and thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chigo. A very, very rich agenda here and a lot of food for thought. Richard, Philip, reaction? I'm sure some of the comments resonated with you or infuriated.
Yes, bit of both.
No, none of this was infuriating. I was actually just thinking about the last point that Chigo made about the narrative and how you think about the impact and results. And I think there, if you are talking to a sort of a global community of experts, then I think it's tempting, and we certainly have done that here today and in the book, is to default towards a global discussion, as in what is the state of PFM systems globally, and have they improved globally? But in reality, that's a very impractical, I was about to say silly way of looking at it, because it's like asking, has governance improved globally? I mean, sure, you can ask that question, and on a sort of, as a political science curiosity, is one that is worth pondering. But the way that this becomes practical is in a particular context, in a particular place and time, in response to a particular set of problems. And I think there, it would be possible to have a much better arsenal of answers, and it would be possible to tell a much more nuanced and much more interesting set of stories, just about, like, for instance, and I was thinking about this a lot during and right after COVID, when I was working primarily with a set of ministries of finance in Africa, and I was based in South Africa at the time. If you had asked me in 2019 that something of this magnitude is going to happen, and all of these ministries of finance and all of these PFM systems are going to come through it reasonably well, without the systems just falling apart in some major way, because the stress and the strain and the tug between all these different forces that are pulling at people's attention and so on, I would have been, my prediction of how that would turn out would have been much more pessimistic than how it did turn out. And these things are definitely worth recording and thinking about more.
Could I add a couple of points? I like very much the comments by Chigo and Andy, and of course, one point that's very important is that PFM is not is a technocratic subject, but the process of change in countries is political and institutional. And my experience of looking across low-income developing countries, and the book is mainly about LIDCs, is that they are relatively weak finance ministries. They're not strong like the UK or France or Australia or the US. They're not like advanced countries. They are generally speaking, fairly weak institutions. In some cases not, but in many cases they are weak. They're also poorly resourced. If you look at the number of people responsible for green PFM in the average LIDC, you probably find 1 or 2 people at the most. And yet they have to grapple with these very complex, very difficult subjects: gender responsive budgeting, green PFM. These topics are not easy, and yet they don't have the resources to take them on. The other thing is that they're very conservative organizations. This is something we are trying to change over time. They're conservative in 2 ways. First of all, they have a structure of accountants and economists and financial managers that are generally separate from each other. They're not absorbed into one class of administrator like happened in the UK Treasury many years ago. They are separate classes of individuals, and they fight and compete with one another. The other thing is they're generally, as I said, focusing on technocratic processes, not policy-making processes. So they have to change their mentality from a focus on technical issues to focus on policy issues. This is what has happened in advanced countries like the UK or America or France or Germany to some extent, but not in NIDCs. These are changes which will take many years, I think, to accomplish, and they're vitally important. They're part of the process of changing a subject which is technocratic into something which has a policy-making function and orientation, and a political orientation. So I very much agree with Chigo's points on this. I think the countries we look at, the LIDCs, are in the process of slow transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip and Richard. I think we should open to the floor now. I'm sure we'll have some questions. We already have some questions online, but I would like to start maybe by a first round in the audience. Yes, thank you. We'll take 3 or 4 and then maybe give the panel and Philip and Richard a chance to respond, and then we'll take another round.
Thanks. It's been a fantastic panel. So I work for a development bank here in the UK and nationally focused. But one thing that strikes me is quite often we and other delivery bodies prize stability and consistency, and we need that. And there are other stakeholders in the market that do so as well, particularly market participants and financial investors. But it sounds like that evolution is desirable relative to revolution when it comes to PFM reform. So I was wondering if perhaps the panel could comment on how you reconcile that tension between the need to constantly evolve and drive change, but at the same time provide that stability for stakeholders as well.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you. So I want to I want to be provocative to make things interesting. But I want to provoke this proposal you made that the toolkit is okay. It's fundamentally okay for the next crisis. But another interpretation would be that the toolkit was found massively wanting in the last crisis. And what I mean by that is that, you said governments did the right thing, say in Africa. They were sold the idea that if they controlled the budget and their spending, that their fiscal position would largely be okay. But actually what's happened is there's been a kind of sharp monetary tightening. Governments have found themselves in balance of payments crises. Their fiscal problems have emerged from the external sector rather than the budgetary mismanagement. And so is there a case that actually we're overselling PFM to finance ministries, that actually it's not problems of fiscal governance that are leading to kind of fiscal challenges or problems of finance ministry capabilities, it's that they don't have enough reserves, not enough exports, not enough robust external positions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Cathal?
Thanks, Megan. And thanks to everyone on the panel as well. What kind of came up for me from almost everyone was this, without the word being said, was communication. So PFM is a means to an end. Where does it end? Should the technocrats working in PFM be able to communicate to policymakers? Or is that a different role? And similarly, should the PFM toolkit include tools for policymakers to communicate with the wider public, or should that be left up to other institutions, including things like think tanks, and Chico mentioned the fiscal ecosystems outside of government? Thanks.
Okay, let's take this round. Stability versus evolution. Then we have, is the toolkit really even fit for purpose or even needed, given that you are always reactive as a Minister of Finance? And then how do you communicate? Is it the role of PFM?
Who want to start from the other side?
Should we start from
Andy,
from here?
feel
Andy,
free to
and then
pick
we'll
a
go this one.
Okay, short straw.
Sorry.
Right, so stability versus, I think my sense is that the stability that people crave is sort of policy settings rather than the underlying systems, like improving accounting systems, improving information systems, improving management systems. I don't think those improvements should affect the private sector in a kind of, oh, my investment was investable and now it's not kind of way. It's just the system is less likely to break in the background. So I would hope that that's not a relevant issue for PFM. I'll leave the provocative question to those who are supposed to be provoked. And communication, I think, is vital, isn't it? The link between the analysts and the policymakers. However a finance ministry is structured, the information has to get out of the PFM system to the the policy maker, whether that's both the policy official and the political choice maker, in a way that's useful. And I remember in my time in the Treasury going through this sort of cycle of whether the nerds should be embedded with the policy teams or not. And I came away from the fact that it was a cycle to say there's no easy answer. You embed the analysts out in the team so that they're closer to their policy making contacts. They go a bit native and they don't get to learn from the other analysts. You bring them all together, they can learn from the other analysts, but they're worse at talking to the policymakers and don't get that chance thing where you overhear that there's a policy problem and you know that the PFM system has some information that will help to answer it. So as with so many things, I don't think there is an easy answer, which is why everything's so context specific and why kind of shipping in PFM answers from somewhere else is difficult and often, counterproductive, and at least in some ways.
Yeah. Chigo? Yeah. Yeah, I'll try and tackle two. Mark, very good and provocative question. I think you're right. On our side, we've been thinking hard about those things, as we always say. These countries are grappling about reserves, exports, external financing positions. Some of the things we've been wondering about is whether this is actually quite timely to talk about how we support some of these countries to take a more longer-term approach to PFM reform, so the balance sheet management approach, where they're starting to think a little bit more about assets, liabilities, and fiscal risks, where there is space to take some of that medium to longer term perspective, but knowing that a lot of these countries have to think in a short-term way. And I would argue and agree, rather, that some of that ought to come into that toolkit more front and center. But I would still circle back to what the book is saying, which is you can have as many tools as you can. At the heart of that is how you deploy them and how you do that in a way that absolutely factors in the context, the specificities and the appetite and the interest, arguably, of politicians when we come to some of these issues that you're flagging. Carl, I think communicating is everybody's business in the PFM system and arena. The one area where I do think we could do more and better on, which ties into what Richard was talking to earlier, is the role of ministries of finance in doing some of that communicating and influencing and corralling. We usually assume that they have the skill set to do so, and or that a lot of that skill set is more policy oriented, but not quite. So I think there is something here, given what the book is also suggesting about the evolving role of ministries of finance, to look closely around the capabilities they require to be able to do and skill themselves up in that way. That's at the heart of some of the public sector reform dimensions, actually, which I would argue perhaps some of it does get a bit divorced from the PFM reform piece, but needing to think about PSR, PFM, and the other elements close.
Philip?
I think in a similar vein, I would say, Mark, I agree with that completely. I think massively, if there's an expectation that having a stronger PFM system with better tools would have made a dramatic difference to the way that the 2022 to 2024 period would have played out, I think that's silly. I think there would have been maybe one or two countries, like if you just look over the entire continent of Africa and the countries that went into debt distress over that period of time, there would have been a few where if they had sort of top of the line debt management systems, that would have really made a difference. I think in the majority of cases, it really wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference. And I think in the majority of cases, the information that was relevant was on the desk of the right people.
Yeah.
I don't think that really took anyone by surprise. I think outside of the ministries of finance, maybe in London and DC and Paris, it took more people by surprise, but it shouldn't have. I don't think it really should have.
But should they be spending so much energy on this stuff then?
No. I think that's a discretion, much more of a discretionary choice. I would land, if you asked me about what are the things that would, because it's another way of asking that question of what are the absolute fundamental basics without which you just cannot do, and if you don't have them, that is a house on fire emergency. And I would draw that circle fairly narrowly, and I think outside of that circle there would be a whole bunch of different options that you can use in different ways, and you can choose to put them together. And I would also, I think this is also something that I think Chico just alluded to. And I think that for you, Andy, from your HMT perspective, my rule of thumb about staff and ministries of finance is that I don't think that there is a very strong dividing line between technocrats and policymakers, or specialists and policymakers, and then politicians. If you, they all should be able to communicate to one another in a way that is maybe not completely seamless. Obviously, these are different roles and people who are coming into that from very different backgrounds and so on. But my rule of thumb would be that if you are working in an area of specialty that is just so technocratic and so sort of science heavy, whether that science is monetary economics or it's how to forecast the weather, then you probably shouldn't be in a policy making outfit like a central government ministry. You should probably work in a specialized agency where you can just geek out with the people who specialize in geeking out about that sort of stuff. If you do work in a central government ministry, then you specialize in policy. You don't specialize in whatever your technical expertise is.
Yeah.
But if I could add, I slightly disagree with Philip on this. I think the countries I see that are low-income developing countries do not have the communications which Philip espouses. In fact, they are broken into silos. The departments operate independently. The budget department, the treasury department, the finance department, and so on. These are separate departments. They do not operate, generally speaking, with the coordination. And there is also a fragmentation of the professional structure between accountants and economists and financial managers and so on. So a great deal of work needs to be done to make the ministries more communicative. I think communication is really important, and that is what is missing at the moment in many developing countries. So I take a rather more pessimistic view than Philip on this. I think we can easily say what should be the case, but what is the case is not the case, is not the same as what should be the case. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Great. We have 3 questions online. So are there more questions in the audience? We take a last round, and I will also read the question online so we can address them. Yes. Yes.
So you spoke about the fact that the overall picture is not one of substantial improvement around the world, but there were some bright spots. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the features are of those countries which have made progress and whether those relate to kind of the nature of specific institutions or the broader social contract and kind of political environment within the country.
Thank you. Ed?
Thank you. Just to pick up that point around how PFM and its scope has sort of seems to have expanded quite significantly over the period, or at least the interaction with other issues and other themes. I think you call it sort of PFM plus X. A little bit of sense of what's motivating that. I think probably everyone in this room sees that because many people are involved in it, and it seems to feel like the frontier is no longer the core, quite literally. Is that simply and straightforwardly, and maybe picking up something I think Richard might have been saying, is that the frontier of what good looks like is a policy-oriented ministry. The core nuts and bolts of PFM is a bit of a settled science, and so there's just a sort of a normative trend in that direction, and that's causing people to then explore these policy-adjacent questions. Might it otherwise be this point, which I think came at the presentations, that maybe PFM's been called into service much more routinely, much more heavily over the last few years, whether it's thicker and faster crises or whether it's just the communication of crises, one could debate. But or might it be not spoken, but just actually the incentives of the people, the sort of technical involved, it just seems more interesting, more fun. The search for relevance. People are a bit bored of playing around with tweaking PIFA scores and trying to look at budget classifications. And I mean, let's not avoid individual motivation in people trying to make their jobs more interesting and ministries trying to make themselves more relevant, powerful. And the question is just to what extent these sort of themes played out across the chapters in the book, and whether there's any sense of, if not resolution to it, then guidance of where we might be finding ourselves.
Great. Actually, so online we had a question which is a little bit along the same line as Ed, which is about whether there has been actually an overreach in PFM and the return are diminishing at the margin. So that's one of the questions. There is also a question around the rise of global infrastructure financing platforms. So the BRI led by China, the EU Global Gateway, and whether that shift towards financialized model of development aid, does that affect PFM? That's, I think, is an interesting point if there are views. And then there is a really specific question on the role of the International Public Sector Standards Board's completion of public sector accounting standards and that role in the development of PFM in the last 15 years. So if someone in the panel has any views, please share. So this round of question, I think we have 10 minutes. So I suggest maybe each pick a question and develop rather than trying to answer all of them. Who comes next? Richard. Sorry. Yes, Richard, do you want to take some of his questions? I always worry that because you're online, we may be.
No, not at all. I simply wanted to make the point that, of course, there are some developing countries that are doing well. I mean, examples of Philippines and Georgia and Rwanda, to pick three at random. Of course, progress is not uniform, or lack of progress is not uniform. The general picture on progress, as exemplified in PIFA indicators, is not particularly good, as Philip was saying. But there are some highlights, and there are some countries that do better, which makes it clear that it's possible to do better. And in particular, for example, Georgia is one of the stars in the PIFA ratings, and it has improved enormously the communications between different departments of the Ministry of Finance. So it is possible to do this. I simply wanted to make that point. I'll hand back to Philip.
Thank you. Philip.
I mean, just to build on that point, I don't think I would want to pick out a particular set of countries necessarily, but I think it's definitely true that if you look at areas, for instance, like TSA, payment systems, and so on, if you had asked me at the start of this period in 2010 or so, I think there were a lot of people at the time who were fairly pessimistic about the state of play. And we were looking at these IFMIS systems that often looked like white elephants, and they weren't very practical. They were very expensive. There's this joke about, you go to the IFMIS has been introduced, and then you go to like the local treasury office and you ask people, so where do you keep the accounts book, which you're not supposed to keep anymore because everything has migrated to the electronic system, and without fail, people just pulling the book out of a drawer somewhere where everything is done meticulously on paper and then entered into the electronic system at some point or another when it needs to happen. And I think that's just a completely different space now, and is also an area where you would have to say, yes, politics, power, and so on and so forth, but the way that technology is deployed in that sector, I think, makes it very hard to do certain informal practices in a way that was a lot easier when you were able to do these things on paper. And so these areas of progress are definitely there. I also think that I think in many ministries of finance, the willingness and the interest of senior decision makers to engage with evidence and policy analysis, that interest is a much more binding constraint than the ability of people to produce analysis and analytical work at a fairly high sort of standard of quality, because a lot more people would have gone abroad and gone, to places like the LSE and done a master's and come back with a toolkit. They are able to do research online. They are able to use statistics in a way that people wouldn't have been able, not as many people as easily would have been able to. And if you are in a position where you're saying we could do a lot more analytical work, it's just that our bosses don't care about this, it's still a problem. But I think it's less of a problem than you saying, if I cast my eyes around this ministry of 1,500 people, and I wouldn't even know where to begin if we wanted to do some of these types of assignments in-house. And it's easy to underappreciate just how much of a potential for further change and future impact that is going to have in the years to come, because I think it's something that actually has been changing fairly rapidly in the last 10 years or so.
Chigo?
Yeah, okay. So important and interesting question on global infrastructure platforms. So I think two threads. I think if anything, they underscore the importance of public investment management systems and how to nurture, grow them, and make sure they're more robust, PFM terrain. But most importantly, I think shifting that focus where we've done a lot of supply side strengthening of PIM systems to making sure that the decisions that are being taken in using those PIM systems are transparent and bring about a lot of accountability and can yield sort of a pathway to illustrating how those infrastructure decisions are actually yielding the intended outcomes and benefits to citizens. So we have a responsible infrastructure investment campaign initiative within FCDO that's very much at the heart of that, building the demand side using the evidence we're pulling together from countries across sort of the Southern Africa sphere, but also Asia and so on, which we hope can culminate into being quite evidence-based. Can't help myself, I've got to respond to two more things.
Please do.
Norms and standards, we absolutely need them. I think as I was landing earlier, they are what lead to function. So they are part of form. And I think in the PFM arena, we've got to be really proud about the fact that what we've actually set out as quite credible norms and standards on be it PEFA, fiscal transparency and accountability that are subscribed to from the international arena, but also domestically. It's so exciting to see the different countries we work in using them as sort of the bulwark of what they can do. So they're important. And lastly, I don't think we're overreaching on the PFM agenda. If anything, I think, yeah, of course, it's fun, but it's also at the heart of everything we do. So I think everybody's just waking up to the fact that this is at the heart of power and how it's manifested. Yeah.
And it's okay to have fun.
Yeah, totally.
Andy.
So building very much on that last point, so the jobs I ended up doing in government, the OBR job in particular, was I enjoyed it because there is nothing that goes on in a country that doesn't somehow affect, you know, one of the components of the debt dynamics equation, which was my life. And it, you know, PFM plus X is happening because those X things, climate in particular, they are affecting the public finances, the revenue base, the tax base, the economy, and therefore, you know, if you're going to do something about it, you've got to pay for it. If you're going to pay for it, it's got to be in the budget. If it's going to affect your revenue base, it's got to be in the budget. You've got to think about it. So that kind of the marrying up of, you know, in my head, it used to be fiscal arithmetic and everything that's going on in government. It's the same as the marrying up of PFM and everything that goes on in government.
Okay. Brilliant. I think we can bring that conversation to a close. Thank you so much to all the speakers, Philip, Richard, a brilliant panel, Chigo and Andy, and of course everybody here in the room, but also online for this stimulating, exciting and rather fun and provocative discussion. I think it just shows how dynamic, fast-moving, but extremely relevant PFM is. So certainly I got this image of engineer, but also communicator, media people, building tools, but also politician and power, agent of power, which makes this work really exciting. This is just the beginning, or it's a continuation of a conversation we've had at ODI Global, so please stay tuned. And in particular, I want to flag the fact that we will have our public finance conference here in London at ODI on the 7th and 8th of October, where we will discuss economic resilience. So everything that we've been discussing about the toolkit and the climate and how we adjust to PFM for the future will be discussed in more depth. And we very much hope you will join us. And for those in the room, we'll have drinks next door. But thank you, everybody, in particular online, in particular, Richard, for a great participation. Thank you.